Once long ago, when Virginia was still a British colony, there was a young woman named Elizabeth. Now, she was the only child of a wealthy landowner. He had land and crops and servants and a beautiful house decorated with fine furniture and carpets and tapestries, and he had the finest horses anywhere for miles around. And so Elizabeth lived a life of luxury and love, for it was just her father and herself, her mother having died when she was just a small child. But as you can imagine, when Elizabeth got of an age to be married, there were no lack of suitors for her hand. But there was one young man who was handsome, but also so witty and so charming and so clever and so persuasive in his words that she gave her heart to him. And her father, seeing the inclination of his only child, he agreed to their marriage. It was a festive occasion. Everyone came. Everyone wished them well, Elizabeth and Jim, her husband, and they imagined that they would live in happiness ever after. And it looked like that would be the case. One sad thing was only a couple of months after they were married, Elizabeth's father died. And so everything that her father owned, the land and the crops and the house and the horses and everything, it was inherited by, now, don't say Elizabeth. It was not inherited by his only child, for in that day and in that time, a married woman could own no private property, and so it was all inherited by Jim, her husband. And people said, well, it's pretty much the same thing, husband and wife, one in dreams and intention and action, and for a long time it looked like that was the case. They lived in the house that Elizabeth had grown up in. They had a child of their own, a lovely little girl they named Jane. And Jane grew up in that house as well, and with the same comforts and luxuries that her mother had enjoyed. But after a while, it became increasingly clear that Jim had one dreadful fault, and that was that he was drawn to gambling. And at first it was just a friendly bet with a friendly friend down at the local tavern. It was usually a bet on a horse race. And because Jim's horses were the finest anywhere around, he won those bets more often than not. But the more he won, the more he bet. And, well, gradually he bet not only on horses, but on dogs and on crop futures. And finally, if he was in the tavern and there were two ants on a table, he would be willing to bet on which one would reach the edge of the table first. And he bet so often and so injudiciously that he began to lose. And the more he lost, the more he bet, and the more he bet, the more he lost. And at first he just lost money, just money. But then he lost his hat, and he lost his cane, and he lost his pocket watch, and then he started betting on the things that he had inherited from Elizabeth's father. He began to lose the horses one at a time, and the land a parcel at a time, and he began to lose the tapestries and the rugs and the silver in the house, and finally the house itself. And so he had the sad job of telling Elizabeth and Jane, now a tall girl of 13, that they were penniless and homeless. But he did have a plan, though. He joined the army. And in joining the army, he guaranteed a roof over his head and food in his stomach. And because he was married and had a child, Elizabeth and Jane could come along as camp followers. And so they did. It was not a wonderful, luxurious life, but it was to get worse. For after only 6 months in the army, well, Jim died also. And it wasn't bravely in battle, defending his homeland and culture against foreign evil usurpers. No, it was a bet gone wrong, and a man with a hot temper and a loaded pistol. And so now, Elizabeth and Jane packed their few meager possessions into a cart, which they pushed out of the camp and down the road toward the nearest large city, Jamestown. And as they walked, they had plenty of time to talk and think and plan. And one day, well, Elizabeth said, "What are we to do, Mother?" And Jane said, "What are we to do, Mother?" And Elizabeth said, "Well, I intend to get a job as a servant in perhaps a boarding house. And you, perhaps the same?" And Jane said, "Mother, I've been thinking, would it not be better if instead of being 2 women alone, we would be a woman and a teenage son? And then I could be an apprentice." She said, "I would not have you anything but what you are, Jane." She said, "Well, Mother, just listen to me." And Elizabeth watched as her daughter put on some of her husband's old clothes and tucked her hair up into a hat. She had to admit, it was pretty believable. And so she agreed to the crazy plan, and for the rest of the way into the city, while Jane was practicing taking long and confident strides and speaking in a voice as low as she could muster and introducing herself as John. When they got to the city, Elizabeth was hired right away by the first boarding house they stopped at. She had a lovely way of speaking and genteel manners. And then Jane went out looking for a position as an apprentice. She went to the butcher and the baker, and I'm sure the candlestick maker as well. She went to the ostler, and she went to the silversmith and the goldsmith, and finally she ended up at the glassblower shop. And as it happened, in all the other places, the master craftsman had apprentices, but the glassblower, he had recently lost his apprentice. He had reached the end of his apprenticeship and had gone west to seek his fortune, and so although Jane had no experience whatsoever, she was determined and she was so persuasive that he agreed to take her on as an apprentice. And this turned out to be a very good decision by the glassblower, because Jane, well, she was strong enough to heft a pole with a lump of molten glass and deft enough to turn it into any number of useful items. And in fact, after only a couple of months in the shop, she could make anything that the shop produced, goblets and platters, anything at all. And in fact, occasionally people would come in, customers, who would request that their orders be filled by the glassblower's apprentice, because they fancied that what she produced was a little more delicate and a little more refined than the work of the glassblower himself. And so things were going along well. But then one day, a man came into the shop to pick up an order of goblets. And as the glassblower packaged up the order, the man looked around the shop, and his glance fell upon Jane. She had an uneasy feeling about that, so she turned away so he couldn't see her face. But as she was thinking, she thought he seemed so familiar. And then it occurred to her. It was an old friend of her father's, Mr. Hogsworth, and surely he was also one of the ones that her father had still owed money to when they became penniless. She had a sense of foreboding about that, and well, in fact, that evening, Mr. Hogsworth showed up at the boarding house. He'd asked for Elizabeth, and when she came to the door, he said, "You owe me money." She said, "I do?" He said, "Well, your husband." She said, "My late husband." He said, "Well, I am owed money, and I intend to collect." She said, "But I have nothing." He said, "You have a job, and I know that you will be paid at the end of the week. I will be here to collect until the debt is paid off." She said, "But how will we live, my child and I?" And he said, "Oh yes, your child. I was in the glassblower shop today, and I saw the apprentice that the glassblower referred to as John. But if I'm not mistaken, it is Jane, your daughter, is it not?" Now the glassblower doesn't know, but if he were to discover this, Elizabeth knew full well if the glassblower were to discover Jane's identity, she would lose her apprenticeship, and, well, Elizabeth would probably lose her job as well. That was the tenor of the times. The man said, "Well, think it over. I'll be back at the end of the week for my money." Well, Jane and Elizabeth talked that over that night, and Jane said, "Mother, I have a plan. It's chancy, but if it works, it'll solve our problem." And so she went to work early the next day, and with the approval of the glassblower, she made something for herself. And what she made was this. It was a hollow glass ball with strands of glass running through the middle. They were very popular in England and in the colonies. People hung them in the entryway of the house, and they believed that if any witch, first it was called a witch ball, well, some people called it a wish ball, but the more accurate term was witch ball. So if a witch came, or anyone who intended them harm, they would be taken by the shininess of the ball, and they would enter inside and be trapped by the filaments. So Jane made a wish ball. Blue, because that was also known as a color that repelled evil creatures. She brought it back to the boarding house and she hung it in the entryway. And sure enough, at the end of the week, Mr. Hogsworth came back, and he summoned Elizabeth to talk to him. And as Elizabeth stood there, well, I don't know how such things happen, but one minute Mr. Hogsworth was standing there, and the next minute he was gone. And there was a dark shadow inside the witch ball. Well, Jane took that witch ball down and she wrapped it carefully, and she took it to work the next day, but not to the glassblower shop, not at first. She took it next door to the blacksmith shop. Now, Jane had been very careful not to make friends. She didn't want anybody to know her secret, but the blacksmith had an apprentice, Rob, who was about her age, a very friendly young man, and they had seen each other coming and going and on breaks, and they did become friends. In fact, finally one day, Jane told him her secret, and he laughed and said he had guessed that right away, but he would keep the secret for her. And now she needed to trust him. She handed him the witch ball, and, well, Rob had come to the end of his apprenticeship as well, and he had signed on as a cabin boy on a sailing ship that was traveling, as he said, to the ends of the earth. And she said, take this, and when you get to the ends of the earth, drop it into the ocean. He said, but it will float. She said, you must put some weight on it so it will sink. Well, he agreed. And in the ensuing months, things went along fairly well. It was almost a year before Rob strode back into the glassblower shop. And Elizabeth greeted him enthusiastically. She said, and so how was your trip? And tell me about the witch ball. He said, oh, when we reached the farthest ridge of our voyage, I thought this might be a perfect place to let the witch ball go. He said, and then I saw that one of the native fishermen who had joined our crew seemed frightened of the spot. I asked him why, and he said, well, this was supposed to be the deepest part of the ocean. No one knew how deep it was, but they were afraid of it because they believed that on the bottom of the sea, there was a fearsome sea creature who jealously guarded any treasures that came his way. He said, so I knew it was the perfect place. I put lead fishing weights on it and I dropped it over the edge and it sank immediately. I don't think you're going to have to worry about whatever's in that witch ball again. Well, if Jane hadn't still been pretending to be John, she surely would have given him a hug and maybe a kiss. It made her so happy. Well, Rob had to leave because the ship was preparing to go out again. And every year it went out and came back, and every year he came back into the glassblower shop, and he and Jane renewed their friendship. And so time passed, and the year that Jane's apprenticeship was up, and that she and Rob were both 19, when he came back, he asked her to marry him, and she agreed. It was a very simple ceremony. Things were exciting in Virginia in those days. There was talk of rebelling against England and becoming their own country. And so there were petitions signed, and there were demonstrations held, and there were marches, and in all the excitement, very few people noticed when a glassblower's apprentice and a cabin boy on a sailing ship were married. And when they packed up and left, along with the apprentice's mother, for the West and a new life for themselves. And I suppose we must say that they lived happily